Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Sustainable Activism webinar. My name is Lisa Levinson, and I'm the director of the Sustainable Activism campaign with In Defense of Animals. And we have this monthly webinar series that we put together to provide resources for animal activists and people who care for animals to give them the resources they need to continue being in the movement for the long haul. And so today we're very, very excited to welcome Professor Stephen Wise, who's our guest speaker, and I'm going to give you a little bit more information about him. So Stephen Wise began his mission to gain rights for non-human animals in 1985. He holds a JD from Boston University Law School and a BS in chemistry from the College of William and Mary. He has practiced animal protection law for 4 decades and is admitted to the Massachusetts bar. Professor Wise taught the first class in animal rights law at the Harvard Law School and has taught animal rights jurisprudence at the Stanford Law School as well as at the University of Miami. The Vermont Law School, St. Thomas, and John Marshall Law Schools, and is currently teaching animal rights jurisprudence at Lewis and Clark Law School. He is the author of 4 books, Rattling the Cage, Toward Legal Rights for Animals, Drawing the Line, Science and the Case for Animal Rights, Though the Heavens May Fall, the landmark trial that led to the end of human slavery, and an American trilogy, Death, Slavery, and Dominion along the banks of the Cape Fear River. His TED Talk from the TED 2015 conference in Vancouver, Canada, was released in May of 2015 and has over 1 million views. It's our great honor today to have Stephen Wise here with In Defense of Animals to present a bit about his recent work and also to give activists some advice and about how to overcome obstacles. So thank you, Stephen. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Yay, it's such a pleasure. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to let everyone know we'll have an opportunity to do Q&A after your presentation. And for the meanwhile, we're going to let you take it away. And please, if anyone has questions, you can type them into the chat box. And if you're with us on Facebook Live, you can do that as well. And we will see you in a little while for some questions. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Oh, well, hello to each one of you. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Let me talk to you both about the Nonhuman Rights Project and about the idea of sustainable activism. I actually began a little bit earlier than Lisa had said. I read Peter Singer's book, I think in 1980, and in 1981, seems like a long time ago, in 1981, I learned about a group of lawyers who was going to form a national organization, and that was first called Attorneys for Animal Rights, and then it became the Animal Legal Defense Fund. And so in 1981, that's when I went to a meeting in New York City. I met Joyce Tischler, David Faber, other colleagues who I still know, some of whom are still affiliated with the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and decided that I wanted to stop practicing the kind of law I had been, which was criminal law and personal injury law, and begin doing what I really wanted to do, which is work on behalf of non-human animals. At that time, I did not think about working for the rights of non-human animals. In fact, I didn't quite know what I was going to do at all, and none of us really did. For the first few years, we would meet in San Francisco, and we would just try to talk about how we could gain entry into this horrible mess of billions and billions of non-human animals being injured and killed and exploited, and how do you begin to use the law to help them? We really didn't know, and so we began to work for the next 4 or 5 years trying to come up with various ideas as to how we might alleviate the suffering, help the welfare of non-human animals. About 1985, after I had been working for almost 5 years, both in my private law practice and with Attorneys for Animal Rights, I realized that What I was doing was what I would now call, animal protection law, but that it was not really effective. That as long as non-human animals were not, as long as non-human animals lacked rights, I didn't think that that I was ever going to be able to make any serious progress, and no one was going to be able to make serious progress in being able to help them. So I began to try to understand what the problem was, and again, I really still didn't think about there being a rights problem. David Faber and I began to try to think about this together, and we thought that there was, as we lawyers would talk about, that there was a standing problem because we and other lawyers were being thrown out of court all the time on grounds of standing. That the judges said that since we were not injured, we could not sue, and of course the non-human animals were being injured, but they couldn't sue either because they were not legal persons. And I began to really understand what the difference was between a legal person and a legal thing. And so a legal person is an entity of any kind who has the capacity for one or an infinite number of legal rights, while a legal thing is an entity that lacks all capacity for any sort of legal right. So a legal person has the capacity for a lot of rights. In some fundamental way, legal persons count in our legal system. Judges can see them. Society and the law care about their interests. If you're a legal thing, you are seen as having not intrinsic value like a legal person does, but only having instrumental value, in that your value is only what the legal persons of the world say it is. So if people wish to exploit other people or other entities of any kind, they see to it that those entities are legal things who lack the capacity for any kind of rights, rather than legal persons, who might have rights. So, examples of legal persons are you and I, corporations, ships, partnerships, the state of California, all sorts of entities that the law says they ought to have certain kinds of rights, and they ought to count in some kind of fundamental way. Throughout history, legal things have been human slaves, sometimes women, sometimes children, sometimes Native Americans, and others who are seen as being open to being exploited. And so the way you exploit them is you view them as legal things who, again, have no kind of intrinsic value, but all their value is only whatever legal persons say it is. So David Faber and I began to think about this problem of how we would deal with trying to gain legal personhood for at least some non-human animals. Non-human animals had never been persons, through every legal system, at least in the West. Since Roman times, they had only been legal things. So we had 2,000 years of law that said that all non-human animals were legal things. And that, of course, explained why we were able to exploit them in such fantastic numbers and do such terrible things to them. So we began to think about that. As a few years went by, we tried to develop theories, but as to why non-human animals ought to be legal persons. But it looked like it was going to be a very hard problem. And so here's both the activism and the sustainable activism start to come in. So, it's 1985. Non-human animals, all of them, are legal things. They are being exploited and killed, even in the United States by the billions every year. The legal system supports this. And what do we do? Well, there were a lot of things that were going to have to be done because there was hardly anything in 1985 that existed that was going to assist us. So we knew we were going to have to create it. That was going to be a big problem. So we knew that, for example, we'd have to come up with various kinds of legal theories. David worked with me for the first few years, and then I think he became the acting dean of his law school, and he dropped out for a few years, and ever since then, he's been now working on his own various kinds of theories. So there had to be a lot of thinking done as to what sort of legal theories might eventually be sufficient to break through this problem of legal thinghood for non-human animals. How are we going to be able to persuade courts and legislatures potentially to treat non-human animals as legal persons? So that ended up taking quite a lot of time. In fact, I realized I had to understand a lot more about the legal system in which I worked than I knew. I was a practicing lawyer. I think I had written one law review article in 1985, but I really wasn't a scholar. I am today. I am a scholar today because, as Lisa said, I've written now 4 books, and I think I've written 22 law review articles that all aimed at trying to create legal personhood or come up with theories that would create legal personhood for non-human animals. So I knew that it's going to take a long time, and I began to try to understand what law was, what rights were, where law came from, where rights came from. Why did some entities? Why were some entities persons? Why were some entities things? How did those who were things and eventually became persons? How did that happen? I actually worked on that for 7 years. I would go, at that time I was living in Boston. I would go to the Boston University Law Library and just pull out books, beginning with the with the folks who lived 4,000 years ago, who began to develop law to try to understand how law came about, how rights came about. So it did indeed take about 7 years before I could really begin to try to understand how I might be able to apply that. So I knew that that was going to take a long time. I didn't quite know it was going to be 7 years before I could really start, but indeed that's how long it did take. Then I knew that in order to be able to persuade judges, they were going to have to be persuaded that what they were doing was not crazy, that it wasn't way out in left field or right field, that it was somewhat in the center of jurisprudence. So we had to, I thought we needed to begin to develop courses in animal law, animal rights, that would be taught in law schools. We had to begin to write law review articles and persuade others to, so that it began to have some kind of intellectual heft to it. So in 1990, I was asked to teach, I think, the second class in animal rights law. And I've never taught animal law. I've always taught either animal rights law or animal jurisprudence, which is really the study of rights. And that's because I believe that rights is really where you're really protected. So, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 6 of that, says that every individual shall be a person. And the reason is, if you're not a person, then you're a thing, and people can exploit you. The International Convention for Civil and Political Rights, I think Article 16, also says the same thing. Every individual, has the right to be a person. So that's really important. So I began to write, and as you saw, I've written a lot over the years. And when I get ideas, I try to put them out into the legal community so I can get comment on it. So there'd be something to cite when we started filing lawsuits. And so my brothers and sisters in the law could begin to understand that this was something that was going to be coming. So I began to teach. It was rather slow until about the year 2000. 10 years later, I was asked to teach the first class in animal law at Harvard Law School, and about that time, it began to take off. Interest in it began. Interest in the idea that non-human animals could have legal rights began to take off. And I decided then that the theories that I was spending all these years coming up with, I needed to begin to write them. And I began to write law review articles until about 96 or 97. I realized that nobody was really reading law review articles, even my mother. So I thought what I needed to do was begin to write trade books. And that's where my books came out, and where I think I began to have the most influence was in my first book, was Rattling the Cage Toward Legal Rights for Animals, and that was in 2000. So now I'm 15 years into this project. In 1985, I don't think I mentioned, I had figured that it would be approximately 30 years before I was ready and the world was ready for non-human animals to begin to have any kinds of rights. It would no longer be things, but could be persons. So in the year 2000, I was in 15 years, or halfway into what I thought was going to be a 30-year project. Turned out I was unduly pessimistic. It only took 28 years to file the first lawsuits. And the folks who filed them was really the Nonhuman Rights Project. That was another thing that I realized had to be done. That this project was way too complex for me to be able to do it on my own. So in 1995, I formed an organization that then became the Non-Human Rights Project, and slowly began to bring lawyers and law students and professors who were interested on. And by the year, I think 2007, so I'm now 22 years into this project, I began to really plan as to how we were going to file the very first lawsuits that would actually seek legal rights for non-human animals. And so that's what we did. We began to plan, and I began to bring other people on, and everyone was a volunteer for almost 20 years before we could ever afford something. Actually, I never fundraised. I didn't have time to fundraise. I either had time to try to figure out how non-human animals could get rights, or I had time to fundraise. So I decided that rather than fundraise, I would spend the time working on this large 30-year project as a volunteer, which is what everyone did. In the meantime, practicing animal protection law in order to make a living. So all of those things then began to come together so that by 2013, the Non-Human Rights Project then was looking back on this 28 years of work and beginning to try to figure out how we would be able to file suit, where we would file suit, what non-human animals would be our clients. So we had to make a whole lot of decisions about that. Where we're going to file suit. As American lawyers or English-speaking lawyers, we could probably file suit certainly in any state within the United States. But we also looked at English-speaking common law countries, those who have a common heritage from England. We thought we might be able to work to try to file suit in a non-U.S. English-speaking country. We eventually decided to focus on the United States, but there's 50 states, there's D.C., there's the Virgin Islands, there's Puerto Rico, there's 54 jurisdictions. And so, between 2007 and 2012, those 5 years, there were probably 60 of us who were trying to understand what the law was on about 60 different legal issues, on all of those 54 jurisdictions within the United States, so we could try to figure out where might we be able to file suit, where it might be either the most helpful or the least harmful to us. Then we had to decide who our clients were going to be. And we decided that we would file suit first on behalf of chimpanzees. And the reason was that I understood, having written about chimpanzees for my book, Rattling the Cage, how extraordinary cognitively complex they were, how autonomous they were, how much we knew about them. I also realized that there were very few of them in the United States, which meant that there was not a gigantic, chimpanzee industrial complex that was going to oppose us. And so they seemed to be well. They're also being treated in a terrible way. There are many of them who were in zoos, who were in biomedical research laboratories, who were just in people's backyards or locked in cages in their garages. And so we decided that we would begin working with them. We almost chose as our first clients elephants. At the last minute, we changed our mind. We since remedied that. As some of you may know, 3 weeks ago, a judge in New York has issued the first writ of habeas corpus, on behalf of an elephant, Happy the elephant, against the Bronx Zoo. And indeed, a week from tomorrow, I'll be in court arguing that Happy should be ordered freed by this judge. And of course, the Bronx Zoo is pretty irritated that we sued them. They'll be in court too. I feel that we have a very good chance of prevailing. We shall see. You never can tell what's going to happen in law. Also, what happens in any single case, is somewhat important, but it's not so important as kind of laying a foundation. in the first 5 years we of filing cases, and I think we filed 7 of them or 8 of them now in the first 5 years. We've never actually won everything. We've never actually been able to have a judge force someone to get rid of their chimpanzees, put them in a sanctuary, though we have forced them to do it through publicity as we were litigating our cases. And certainly in 2015, when a judge in New York City issued the very first writ of habeas corpus on behalf of a chimpanzee, which were Hercules and Leo, who were being imprisoned at Stony Brook University. Once we had the hearing there, that became a little bit too much for Stony Brook University, and they ended up voluntarily giving the chimpanzees to someone else who sent them to Project Chimps. So we were happy to take partial responsibility for having the chimpanzees, out of Stony Brook and into Project Chimps. It's clear if we hadn't filed that lawsuit, that would not have happened. And so we then needed to figure out what our causes of action were. Lawyers have to have some kind of a box you check off, or judges will say, why should I possibly rule in your favor? And that's really what had taken 20 years or more to be able to figure that out. And we do that now. The causes of action that we came up with are the ones that we've been using in the 8 cases over the last 5 years, and we're going to continue to use them for all kinds of technical legal reasons. It helps keep us in court. But there are other kinds of causes of action that we continue to develop, and we hope sometime in the future those will also be helpful too, and we'll be able to use them. So probably a lot of you, aren't even 30 years old or 35 years old, and it may seem extraordinary or unthinkable that somebody would say, well, I'm going to work on this problem, but I don't think I have any chance of seeing it work or it happen for another 30 years. That's what I did because I recognized the immensity of the problem that was facing us. 2,000 years of non-human animals being essentially enslaved. It was not going to end, and the first cracks in that system were not going to appear without an immense amount of thinking, an immense amount of work, an immense amount of organization. So, my advice with respect to sustainable activism is, first of all, you need to be persistent. You need to be creative. You need to be persistent. You need to have a lot of imagination. You need to be persistent. And indeed, the persistence part also did not end in 2013 when we started filing our lawsuits. You can imagine how judges felt who had never even thought of habeas corpus, much for a human being, much less for a chimpanzee. So the first habeas corpus that they ever have to decide in their life is not made on behalf of someone, of a prisoner or someone who's being held against their will. It's made on behalf of a chimpanzee, or it's made on behalf of an elephant. And so this is like an extraordinarily weird thing for them. Especially in the very early cases, the judges didn't even want us in their courtrooms. Some of them did not want us in their courtroom. And so we were not getting very good results. Sometimes we would, but usually we weren't. And so we had to just decide that we know what we're doing. We spent decades doing this. Even though the judges have the power to say we're wrong, we know that they're wrong, and we know that we're right. And we understand throughout history that judges make the similar kinds of mistakes that they're making. As part of my work, I spent a lot of time intensively studying the history of abolitionism, both the non-legal history and the legal history. And in fact, I wrote an entire book about it called Though the Heavens May Fall, which I wrote about 8 years before the Nonhuman Rights Project filed its first case. And I looked at this famous slave trial in London called Somerset versus Stewart, and that was the first time that a slave was moved from being a thing to a person. That at the end of the trial, the judge said, the common law of England will not allow slavery. And I wanted to understand that case. I wanted to know why the judge did that. I wanted to know what the lawyers did. I wanted to understand what happened to the slave. I wanted to understand everything I could about it. And so I wrote that book, Though the Heavens May Fall. And I did it intentionally as a blueprint for how the Non-Human Rights Project would eventually begin to litigate on behalf of not human things, but non-human things. But I figured that the same problems that James Somerset encountered, that James Somerset's lawyers encountered, that the judge encountered, who was a very famous judge named Lord Mansfield, perhaps the greatest judge ever to speak English, but still he was going to encounter these extraordinary problems, and he was going to be hearing this sort of thing for the first time, or the second time, or the third time. Actually, he had heard a couple cases involving slaves before, but not challenging this head on, their slavery, and he didn't like it. He understood that this is a real problem. He was trying to get the lawyers to stop bringing these cases in front of him because he didn't want to decide them anymore. But yet, James Somerset's lawyers did. And so he said that slavery was so odious that the common law would not support it, and he freed James Somerset. And I was really interested to know what were all the political, social, economic pressures that were on him, that were on the slave owner, that were on the slave, that were on the lawyers. Because I figured that similar sorts of things, when we would file suit, which I figured at that point was still around 8 years off, we in the Non-Human Rights Project were also going to encounter. And so I wanted to be able to have those years to research it, to think about it, to try to understand how we might be able to surmount those obstacles as well. So all of this has been an introduction to the fact that those who are active in trying to gain legal rights for non-human animals and also welfare, you're in a system that is stacked against you, and the problems that the system creates is, all you have to do is look around you to see how many billions of non-human animals are still being exploited and killed, brutalized, and how are you going to deal with that? It's not going to be an easy problem to solve. It's going to take a lot of sustained energy, a lot of commitment to what part of it are you interested in working on. None of us can deal with the whole thing. It's just too much. In fact, I realized I couldn't deal with it alone, and the Non-Human Rights Project can't deal with it alone either. We're working with, especially outside the United States, we're working with groups and legal groups. I think in 10 or 15 countries. So that's why I end up traveling. I go to India, I go to Spain, I go to England, go to Sweden, to work with these lawyers as we kind of begin to know each other and begin to work together. So that actually tells you one way of being able to keep going, which is that you find people like you who are committed and who see the problems as you do, who are willing to talk about various solutions. You have to be flexible in trying to work with them because they may have different ideas. They may have better ideas than you have or than I have. But to begin to grow a network, within the United States and throughout the world is extraordinarily helpful. So that's one thing that keeps us going. We are committed to being persistent. When judges rule against us, we actually feel sorry for them because we gave them the opportunity to do the right thing in a long-term way, and that those who rule against us, especially when they rule against us in a biased way or an arrogant, biased way, we understand that one day we're going to look at them the way we in the United States look at the judges who refuse to take an active role in abolishing human slavery, 160, 170, 200 years ago. And we really do feel that we've given them the opportunity to really make a historical difference, to do the right thing, to save the lives of millions and millions of beings, and they've decided not to do that. But when they say we're wrong, we don't think we're wrong, and we just try to figure out how we're going to come back and continue to hammer on the problem that we're hammering on. We feel that our legal theories are quite sound, and judges are certainly beginning to agree with us. We feel that the facts that we bring in front of the judges are quite sound. Any legal case is going to involve legal principles, which we try to explain to the judges and get them to accept it. But then it also involves facts that you apply to the legal principles. So that's one of the reasons, for example, we chose chimpanzees or elephants, because we know that there are so many incredibly smart scientists out there who've been studying them for so many years. They know an awful lot. An awful lot is known about them, and what is known about them is that they are extraordinarily cognitively complex beings. So we're always on the lookout for working with scientists who we can talk to. It helps me. I have a degree in chemistry, so I'm not afraid of science. In fact, when people come to me and say, "What should I study in school in order to become an animal rights lawyer?" I say, "Study science. Study science, study math, study philosophy." Those are I think those three things are really prepare you to think to think very, very clearly. But again, did I mention persistence? You have to be persistent. There'll be times when you lose. In fact, if you're doing something worthwhile, and I tell my students this all the time, if you're bringing lawsuits that you're winning all the time, well, I can bring lawsuits in which I win all the time, but I'm not gaining anything, or very, very, very little. The lawsuits that don't matter very much, those are the ones you win all the time. The ones that really matter, that really strike at the heart of the problem, those are the ones where you're going to get the most resistance, and the ones that are the hardest to win. But then when you do win, they can cause extraordinary change. And so those are the ones that we focus on. But you have to say, I'm committed to this, and I'm going to see it through, and it's important to me. So that's what I do, and I am so lucky and privileged to surround myself with lawyers and others in the Nonhuman Rights Project who feel the same way I do. Some of us in the Nonhuman Rights Project have been together for the last 10 years or 12 years or 9 years, and we rely upon each other, and we've gotten to know each other, and we have there's an immense amount of mutual respect about the talents and the commitment that we all have for each other. So that's another suggestion I have. Find people that you want to work with where there's an immense amount of mutual respect. That helps sustain you. Another thing that I do, and this is just me. Well, maybe other people too, but it certainly is me. Well, there's two things. One is that I don't confront the actual pain and suffering and death of non-human animals. I used to do it when I was younger. It took an enormous toll on me, emotional, mental, psychological toll. I realized at first when I represented 150 dogs when I was practicing animal welfare law in Boston, who would be on death row for doing one thing or another, and I would be called in to try to save their lives. And over 20, 30 years, I was able to save the lives of all but a handful, 3, 4, or 5 of them. That's because their owners were so horrible that the judges were not going to let the dogs live. And so I would begin to meet the dogs, but then I found that it actually interfered with my ability to represent them, that I would be so tormented by the fact that if I lost the case, this dog that I had gotten to know was going to die. I thought it made me a worse lawyer. And then I would go out, and I've been in slaughterhouses, I've been on factory farms. I've seen a lot of things that I frankly wish I hadn't seen, and I don't think that they don't motivate me. In fact, they undercut my motivation. They don't undercut that. They undercut my ability to be a lawyer and step back and be able to analyze what the best thing I can do to help them and to gain legal rights for non-human animals. So that's one thing I do. I don't meet my clients, and I don't expose myself to horrible things because they haunt me. Obviously, I care about them, or I wouldn't be doing this. But I think even more importantly is that they undercut my ability to think as well as I can when I don't. The second thing, and I don't know if it's related or not, I don't read about myself. I don't read about the work of the Nonhuman Rights Project. The Non-Human Rights Project right now, according to the folks who keep track, has about 6 or 8 articles per day that appear about the Nonhuman Rights Project in some way in some part of the world. There's enormous flood, in all media, and I'm not counting like Facebook posts or anything like that. I'm talking about newspapers, talking about radio, TV, magazines. So there's probably 6, 7, 8 of those that average each day. And some of them say that we're doing great stuff. Some of them say we're complete jerks. Some of them are afraid of us. Some of them think we're terrific. I don't read any of them. The reason is that I understand what it is I want to do, and I understand what the Nonhuman Rights Project wants to do, and I understand how we're going to do it. And we frankly don't care whether other people think it's great or other people think it's terrible. We think we understand what we're doing. And I'm as far as I know, within the Nonhuman Rights Project, I'm the only person who feels this way. And so maybe I cheat a little in that I know that if something comes out that I need to know about, someone else in the Nonhuman Rights Project will tell me if something extraordinary has gone on, either positive or negative. Let's see. I was going to talk about the next thing, and the next thing just went into my mind and left. Well, I think I was going to talk to about now anyway, and so I'm really interested to know what people would like to talk about. I remember what I wanted to talk about. The last thing I wanted to talk about was what other direct advice that I can give to animal activists, and that's this. As you can gather from my own story, it's easy to burn out. I could have burned out a long time ago, and I recognize that, and I've worked assiduously to make sure that I don't, because if I burn out, then non-human animals are not going to get any benefits that I might be able to bring them. So all the way along, I've tried to be very careful about what sort of things had a negative impact on me, and then I try to avoid them. On the other hand, I also try to understand what sort of things have a positive impact upon me. What are the things that nurture me and nurture my life, so that I feel that I can do difficult work, but I can sustain myself doing it. I can do it for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, for 40 years, and I'm going to keep going. So what is it that does that? Well, and the recommendations I give are, fall in love, get married, have children. My children are this extraordinary thing that has happened to me, and help raising them, coaching their soccer games, coaching their baseball games, going to their school plays, taking them to the Everglades, riding bicycles with them. Those are the sort of things that nurture me, have always nurtured me. Now they're in college, so I don't get to do that, but they still hang around with me. I take them, we all go together on trips around the world. That sort of thing nurtures me as well. And you have to look at and see what are the things that that are making you unhappy, or you feel you have to kind of get past. So, for example, oftentimes the jobs that activists get, they don't pay very much money, and you have to try to figure out, how it is that you can live on a reasonable income. Because if you don't have a reasonable income, eventually you get tired of doing your job, or you get envious of all the people around you who have a lot more money than you. And so, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how it is I could make enough money to sustain myself and to sustain a family. Took a long time. I made very little money for a long time, and I was always trying to think, how can I make money while not diminishing my commitment and the amount of work I was going to do. So, in short, I say, get a life. Live like the other people are living around you, because that will indeed, at least for me, it'll nurture me. Have relationships, to get hobbies, travel the world, be interested in as many things as you possibly can. And there's a bonus for that too. Not only is it really cool to be interested in lots of things, but I find my work is reinforced by things that I read everywhere, things that I do everywhere, wherever I travel, and I travel the world all the time. People that I meet and who are not involved in animal rights, they might be involved in any sort of thing. I want to sit down and speak with them, and they always tell me things that are interesting. But I always learn something that will actually help me in my work. For remember, a lot of the work that I do is simply human psychology, trying to persuade judges and legislators sometimes that what we're doing is the right thing and what they should be doing is what we want them to do because that's the right thing. How do you encourage human beings to do things that are the right thing and that will help non-human animals? Okay, so now I will stop talking and I invite people to send questions or to ask me questions or however we want to proceed.
Yeah, so first of all, this is Lisa tuning in. I'm the host of this program for In Defense of Animals, and this is one special feature that we provide to offer resources for animal activists and those who care about animals is to provide emotional resources for them. And this has certainly been a great resource. I love all of your advice or your personal reflections on what has really helped you to sustain yourself throughout the years you've been doing this incredible work. So thank you for sharing
Oh,
those
thanks for,
tips.
you're welcome.
Yeah, and we definitely have questions. We have a few questions. For those people who want to just ask your questions directly, you can unmute yourself if you're with us on the webinar just by clicking on your icon that looks like a microphone. Another thing you can do is type it into the chat box. We have a couple questions that are already typed in. If you're on the phone with us, you can press *4 to unmute yourself and then you can ask Professor Wise the questions directly. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, just type it into the chat box. I'll try to get your questions everywhere, but we've got some great ones to start with. So one question is from Renee. I'm wondering, Renee, if you might want to ask your question directly. If you do, feel free to unmute yourself. If not,
Can you
I will
hear
do
me?
my very best. Yes, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Renee.
Hey, fabulous.
Well,
So
hi. Now, that's quite a loaded question that I typed into the chat and into the Facebook. And it's because I am getting ready to, I've already proposed my first bill to a legislator, and I'm green, and I need support, and I know that I have a good cause, but I just, I feel that I'm going to be one of the primary lobbyists, and I want to make sure that I have all the tools to convince the legislators. It's not that bill that I wrote. I just made that up for a hypothetical. That was a bill from last year about the chickens. But you see what my points are there. I want to
Renee, can
there.
you repeat them using your voice so people who aren't able to like read them can hear? If you don't mind restating your question, that would be really helpful.
Yes, let me say, maybe try to give a digest of what I wrote. When we're working with legislators, and I'm in California, oops, I lost it. Went there. It is. When we propose legislation and we want to convince legislators how to, to focus on the core issue of the animal abuse of whatever the abuse is, how much and at what point do we need to prove the other benefits that the legislators would value? Because sometimes they don't make the decisions based on what is the right thing to do, but it might have to do with how much it costs and all these other things. And so, do we need to sidetrack and convince them of all the extra reasons, the monetary, the jobs that are involved, or do we just try to hone in on this is right for the animals, you know?
Well, I don't have very much experience with legislators, although we're beginning to work in that area. In fact, one of the reasons that I chose to begin to work in courts was that all of our arguments are arguments from justice, and courts are in the business. That's really their only business is giving justice. legislators, as you know, are in a lot of businesses. Giving justice might or might not even be one of them. It could be any kind of reason. So I really don't have experience, but with them at least right now. But what I can tell you is that you don't want to go in by yourself if you can. You need to talk to people who've done it a long time. Both being a lawyer and being a lobbyist allows you to gain an immense amount of experience to find out, what works, what doesn't work, and what works with individuals, what doesn't work with individuals, and what sort of a reputation, both in the courts and outside, what sort of reputation do you begin to get? It's a very complex thing that requires a lot of experience. So I suggest you just start getting it.
Okay.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Renee, I know you had a couple of other questions too, about the causes of actions that Stevens used, and I don't know if that's something you want him to elaborate on.
Oh, yes. I was very interested when you said that you had reused your causes of action when the judges need to know why they should judge in your favor. And then you had, found some causes of action, and was just curious as to what your list was, your bucket list of those.
Well, I think the most important one has been the common law writ of habeas corpus. That's why we have used it in all 8 cases. We haven't used any others so far. Habeas corpus has a large number of things about it that make it easier to use especially on behalf of captive non-human animals like chimpanzees and elephants. And that was the cause of action that James Somerset, who was the slave who in 1772, that was the cause of action that his lawyers used. And that's why I went to England. I studied them. I tried to understand what was the pros and cons of using habeas corpus. And it's a unique cause of action that people value a lot because it's used when people don't have liberty. And so judges are very concerned if someone is being imprisoned. And so technicalities go out the window. Things move along very, very quickly. And so that and many other reasons were reasons why we chose that as our first cause of action. Just not the writ of habeas corpus, but the common law writ of habeas corpus, the writ that doesn't come out of a statute or constitution, but comes out of the common law, which is the law that judges make while they're in the process of deciding cases. So that's really the most important one. And so far, nothing has happened to make me think that is not the best one, and that we did indeed make the best choice.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And so people have other questions too, including, I think, Renee suggested that you run for president as one of the suggestions, although I don't know if you're really want that job.
No, I'm very happy with the one I have.
So we do have another question or two. One of them is, in your amazing planning, have you factored in the appeal process from you and or from the owners of the non-human animals?
The appeals process, just in filing a lawsuit?
I believe so. This question is from Marilyn.
Yes. In fact, everything we do is to try to get into the appellate courts. In fact, if we try to get into the high courts of a jurisdiction, it's not easy to do. And first you have to go through the trial level, and that may not be easy either. Then there's oftentimes, except in the much smaller states like Vermont, for example, where there won't be an intermediate appellate court, you just go from the trial straight into the Supreme Court, say, of Vermont. But otherwise, it's you go to an intermediate appellate court, and then if you lose there, you have to then beg the high court of that state to take your case. And the states we've been working in, like New York or Connecticut, they only take about 4 or 5% of the people who come along begging them to take their cases. So it's it's kind of a long, it's a long process. And also unlike the U.S. Supreme Court, the personnel in the state high courts change often. At one point, we had studied what judges are on the state high courts, and we were hoping to be able to learn about them and then file suits so that they would get it. But it turned out that they sit on the high courts for such a short period of time that by the time we get up there, they're no longer there. So that was a lesson. That was a lesson we learned. Did I answer the question? I hope.
So I think
there was something about the owners, but I'm not quite sure what that meant.
You factored in the appeal process from you and or from the owners.
The owners may appeal as well. We don't care who appeals. If we win in the trial at the trial level, let the owners appeal. We have a hearing a week from tomorrow against the Bronx Zoo. If we win, we invite the Bronx Zoo to appeal. In fact, we want to be up in the appellate courts and appeal away.
It sounds like part of the strategy. That's great. And then how to convince decision makers to prioritize doing the right thing over the costs that might be involved with doing that right thing.
Well, there's lots of costs. There can be economic costs, there can be personal costs, there can be emotional costs. Some judges in half the states are elected. That they might worry, are people going to say X or Y depending upon how they rule in a case like ours? Because our cases get vastly more public attention and press than do almost every other case that comes into their courts. When we file a lawsuit in a court, everyone knows about it immediately. And all we have to do is call up the clerk's office and just say my first name, and they'll say, "Oh, this is the chimpanzee case. This is the elephant case." And so people will think about that. We understand that we're trying to make breakthroughs, and I often say we're looking for our Lord Mansfield. I said Lord Mansfield might have been the greatest judge ever to speak English. Well, you needed a great judge, a fearless judge, a morally courageous judge, to be the first one to say slavery is wrong and it's not going to be the law of England anymore, or if it ever was. And so we look for those judges to the extent that we have any control on them. We want to be in front of judges who have courage, who have moral courage, and who are willing to do the right thing. And we've begun to find some there. We have run into some of them. And the great thing is that once you get those judges to kind of stick their neck out and do the right thing, other judges who aren't so willing to do that can then get covered by those early judges and say, well, Judge X says this, and I'm going to follow what Judge X did. Some judges, like everybody else, they just want to show up and do their job. They don't want to be on the front page of every newspaper in the world. They don't want to be on television. They don't want to have people talking about them. They just want to be judges. So those judges probably factor that in. Do I want to be famous? Most judges don't want to be famous. They just want to be judges.
Well, thank you for responding to that question. And we do have some feedback. Amkar was saying, Mr. Wise, that he thanks you for bending the long arc of the moral universe. That's actually a quote from
a number of people, including Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah.
Yes, and he says he's very grateful for compassion, intellect, persistence, and heroic work. A little positive feedback for you.
Well, I actually do understand, and I've thought about that many years, that the moral arc, is long, but it does bend toward justice. So it's up to those of us who are willing to keep bending that arc, keep following it along, because I do agree, it does bend towards justice, but it's not going to. Justice isn't going to occur all by itself. You have to fight like hell for it.
Sounds like we had somebody tuning in. One last question that was related to that one by Amkar is, do you find that younger judges are more open to the non-human cases?
We can't really figure out any pattern. It's we can't figure out any pattern. For some reason, at the trial level, the female judges have been the most open to us, but at the appellate level, the ones who have really given us the hardest time have been female judges. At the appellate level, the most favorable judges have been men, but at the trial level, we've lost every case we've gone in front of a man, in which we've gone in front of a man. So we can't quite figure that out, other than if we're at a trial, we'd like to be in front of a woman, and if we're in an appeal, we'd rather be in front of a man. Only not because there's any intrinsic reason, because that's what experience is simply showing us, unless we don't have a large enough N yet to figure out if there's any real pattern. We haven't really seen that the age of the judge or makes any difference at all. But something tells me that ultimately, in the long run, it will. But I don't know that. I don't know that. People are making incredibly complex, emotionally and politically, historically, philosophically, morally, economically. All of these factors come into a decision as to whether you should issue a writ of habeas corpus for an elephant. We're not really clear as to what kind of a person, other than a person who's thoughtful, educated, intellectual, and has a great deal of moral courage.
Well, again, thank you for answering some of those questions. This is sort of related to that, but have you thought of doing a survey of the judges for your research purposes?
We have, but I think the canons of ethics will not allow them to speak with us. So we would like to do that. I was able to speak to judges in India. Many people don't know that since 2014, or in 2014, the Indian Supreme Court said that all non-human animals in India have both statutory and constitutional rights. And when I was in India in May, I went and had breakfast with the Supreme Court justice who had written that decision to try to understand why he had done it. And also, I had tea. Kevin Schneider, who's the executive director. We were both in India, so Kevin and I both had breakfast with that Supreme Court justice, and then we had tea with another High Court judge of the Delhi court, who had ruled that birds had a fundamental right to fly, and he ordered the birds of the defendant being held by the defendant in front of him to open the cages and let them go. So we wanted to know, why he did it. We're really interested. We're trying to understand why judges rule against us, why judges rule in favor of us, and that was really what lay at the heart of my my spending 3 years writing Though the Heavens May Fall, is really trying to understand Lord Mansfield. Why did he do what he did? He could have done almost anything, but why did he end up doing what he did? And that's what I always want to know. Why are judges doing what they're doing? They're human beings. We're all immensely complex, just immensely.
Well, thanks for sharing that insight about the judges. I think that's so key to many of these cases, and to have the freedom to be able to have tea with some of them and ask these really important questions is quite an honor.
Well, it's interesting. With a few exceptions, judges all over the world know about us. At least some judges. I've talked to judges in Argentina, in Israel, in India, and others who just kind of come up and say, I know who you are. I respect your work. I remember I got a gold medal from the city of Buenos Aires when I went to speak to the city council there, and then I was invited to speak at the Argentine Senate, and I just laughed. I mean, I spoke at the Argentine Senate, and then I said, I live in Coral Springs, Florida. I can't, the people on the Coral Springs City Council don't even want to talk to me about anything, but I can go in front of the Argentine Senate or get a gold medal from the city of Buenos Aires. It's an interesting world.
Yeah. Well, we have just a couple little questions for you, and then we'll let you go.
Sure.
It's getting late where you are. One question was about pigs. Is there anybody who's had a case to advocate for the rights of pigs?
To my knowledge, no one has done that, and there might be all kinds of reasons why. Um, I think that will happen, and it just hasn't happened yet.
And then another person asked, what is the latest, greatest animal rights project you're working on? I think you gave us a little tips and hints about it while you were talking earlier, but
Well, the current one, right? I mean, right now is that a week from tomorrow, we have our habeas corpus hearing on behalf of Happy the Elephant against the Bronx Zoo. Um, Not only am I working on it, it's kind of an all hands on deck. All of us in the Non-Human Rights Project, both lawyers or not, are working, 10, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week to prepare for that hearing. So we are really pointed, toward that. All the while we have other cases in Connecticut we're working on, and we're moving into California. We're going to start bringing cases in California and start working at the legislative level with respect to cities in California as well.
mm, very exciting. And we have one last question. Just aside from your own books, are there any other books that you might recommend? Maybe one or two.
Well, I just keep reading my own books. Uh, no, you know, I don't know why I can't think of them. I up in my office and in my house, I literally have 5,000 books, and I just of all kinds. And I guess I'd have to really sit there and think. Like for example, what I'm reading now. I'm reading a two-volume biography of Charles Darwin. I'm reading a book about a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. I'm reading the history of the city of Jerusalem. I'm reading a book by an Israeli human rights lawyer called The Wall and the Gate, where he talks about the struggle that he's had for 30 years to try to gain rights for Palestinians in an Israeli law system that is biased against them. Of course, I recognize that, very clearly, and so I'm really interested in trying to understand how he dealt with it, how he deals with it emotionally, how he deals with it politically, how he deals with it legally. Um, let's see. I think there's another book that I'm in. I usually read 3, 4, 5 books at the same time, so that's um, I can't remember the fifth one.
Well, we won't test you on that. I want to, on behalf of everyone who's been had the privilege of being with you for this past hour, we just want to thank you all we want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and your experience and your tips. It's been such a joy to spend this time with you, and also want to thank everyone who joined us. Everyone's busy in their own ways, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen and to be part of this conversation, because here we are conversing online on Facebook and all these different multimedia platforms, and we really appreciate everybody for being here and being part of this think tank together. And we hope that everyone takes back something from this experience, something they can add to their own life, whether it's a book to read or some persistence, some advice to be persistent. All of those things will do us very well. So thank you very much,
You're
Stephen
welcome.
Wise, for
You're
being with us
welcome.
this evening. And I hope everybody has an excellent night. And we do these every month, so if you've registered, you'll get a reminder for the presenter for next month. And we also have other online gatherings. We have a vegan spirituality gathering next month, next week, where we'll be reviewing our experience doing vegan advocacy at the Parliament of World Religions. So again, thanks to everybody for being part of our community and for joining us this evening. Have a
Thank you
wonderful
for
night.
inviting me.
Mhm. Thank you, Stephen. Good luck on your
Thank
case
you.
next week. We're all going to be rooting for you.
You win, you lose. We're always hoping to win, but whether we win or lose, it's simply the next step as we push on.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everyone. Good
Good
night,
night.
all.